It was amazing. Before we get started, and today I know it's been a couple of weeks, so I believe we're in chapter 26. We're going to start making the transition from the story of Isaac into the story of Jacob. There will be some overlap there in the next few chapters. Before we get to that, I want to thank you for all of your well wishes over my birthday weekend, which was last weekend. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I was sitting around my house, and Kate said, I have a surprise for you. And I was sitting around my house, because I live there. And Kate was like, hey, I have a surprise for you. And I was like, oh, that's cool. What is it? Because you can't, nobody likes surprises that they know about, right? It's just like, don't tell me that there's a surprise and then surprise me. But if you're going to have one and then tell me, that's just like cruel and unusual. So she's like, well, I'm not going to tell you. And I was like, well, you can't do that. Explained the whole thing I just said. She's like, well, do you want to know? I was like, of course. I thought that was obvious. So it turns out she had, Key West is one of my bucket list items, and she had gone and scheduled this trip for us to spend about not quite 48 hours down in Key West. We flew out on a Friday. We got there around lunchtime, flew back on Sunday. But we had a really good time, really beautiful, beautiful place if you've ever had a chance to go. If not, I highly recommend it. Whoa. We walked a lot. I was expecting, like my mental image of this place was that it was like Florida beachy, but it's more like island beachy, I guess. There's not a whole lot of beaches there, but a lot of amazing sea life, beautiful sunsets, great food. I'd never had Cuban food before, and that was something I wanted to try, so we did that. We stood at the southernmost point of the continental U.S., and we're walking there, because we're walking everywhere. We didn't have a car down there. But the island is only like 3 miles wide. So we're walking down there, and we're walking. She's like, you've got to go see the southernmost point. She just went there with her friend Andrea in like February. And she's like, but it's going to take a while to get there. I was like, okay, it's fine. And she's like, and then when we get there, you're going to be tired and cranky. And I was like, well, I might be tired, but I'm not going to be cranky. She's like, Matt, when you get tired, guess what you also get? And so she's like, you're going to get there and be tired and cranky, and it's hot. Like, oh my gosh. We lived in Mobile for a while. Kate grew up in South Florida, but I always forget how humid it is there. And that doesn't mean I'll never complain about the humidity here again, but when we got off the plane, I felt, coming back here, I felt like the air was about 100 pounds lighter than it was. I was just so humid. So we get there, and she's like, we're going to get to the southernmost point, and it's going to be anticlimactic, and you're going to be like, why did we walk this far? And I was like, no, I won't say that. We got there, and it was anticlimactic, and I was like, why did we walk this far? I'm feeling a little tired and cranky right now. So we looked, it was cool. It was neat to see. There's a good marker there, but there's this line that was like an hour long where people standing in line to take a picture in front of this little monument. So you didn't see a picture of us because I was tired and cranky and unwilling to stand in the line that long. We sat down in front of some really big fans under umbrellas and just watched people for a while. But we got to see, Ernest Hemingway is from there, so we got to go see a lot of the stuff related to his house. President Harry Truman built a little White House down there. I didn't know that. I guess he used to summer down there quite a bit, so it was a really good time. But Kate and I are kind of in the midst of a season of travel right now. So I'm taking some vacation time over much of September, but I also wanted to be able to be back here with you all as much as I can during the week. And so I'm grateful to Gary Clark, who brought another excellent message this past Sunday. Randy Silver is going to be preaching this coming Sunday. Randy is also a certified lay servant. They used to call them speakers. So he'll bring a great message. And then we're going out of town. Kate surprised me with a trip for my birthday to Key West. Kate surprised me with a trip for her birthday to, I think we're going down to the Dominican Republic. So we're taking the kids with us on that one. So those Sundays are coming up later in September because I wanted to, as much as possible, have all that wrapped up before some things come on this fall that we're getting ready for. So the first week that I'm gone for that trip, you're going to hear from Allie Shahan. Allie Shahan is the Director of Student Life at Oklahoma City University. She was recently commissioned as a deacon in the United Methodist Church. Her husband, Adam, is the lead pastor at Wesley United Methodist, which is right there on the campus of OCU. It's a beautiful church. Adam and Allie Kate and I had each of them when they were kids in United Methodist camps down at Cross Point, I think. Did you have a question? I can tell you, yeah. But it's not going to matter because you're going to be here the next Sunday too. Let's see. It's going to be, all right, so Allie will be here on the 18th of September. She's a great person. She's a great speaker. She's very engaging. You will not want to miss that. The following week is the 25th, and Dr. Tiffany Nagel-Monroe will be here. She is the director of St. Paul School of Theology on the campus at OCU. Both of them have served in churches. Allie and Adam actually served at Moore First in the associate role for a while. Tiffany Monroe was at Shawnee First Methodist before she took this current appointment. Also, if you got to meet Tiffany, if you came to my house for the fundraiser that we held, she was the person that made an introduction there. Great speaker, very engaging, intuitive. The idea that we have had to start a foundation here, nonprofit, for our outreach ministry came from what she did at Shawnee St. Paul's. So you probably will not meet Allie's husband because he'll be preaching that day. Tiffany's husband, Tate, will be here. They're phenomenal people, and they're going to be great messages. So make sure you're here for those things. And then I will be here until I'm not. So, all right. I know it's raining out there, so if you're watching us today, we're glad to have you whenever you are. I'm glad you're with us. The scriptures are holy. Before we consider them, we should pray. Let's do that. Gracious and giving God, we're grateful today for the rain that we have needed. And all too often, we ask you for things, and then we forget to thank you for what you provide. We're so grateful, God, for the rain. We're grateful for fellowship that we have here, for the opportunity to learn and grow, to visit with one another, to have a break in the middle of our week where we can come together for fellowship and community and have an opportunity to decompress together, even as we're learning more about how you have been at work within the hearts of your people for the entirety of our existence. We pray, God, that you would open those hearts today, that we might learn more about who you are calling us to be in whatever way you know we need to learn in order to grow to get there. This we ask in your name. Amen. A couple of church members that are just having some health-related issues. I'm not going to say anything about it because I have not had permission to do that, especially live streamed. But so just keep those folks in your prayers. God knows who you're praying for, so continue to do that. We have a couple of medical procedures coming up in our congregation in the next few weeks, and so I know those people are going to covet your prayers. All right, here we are, chapter 26, Isaac and Rebekah. Now you're going to see something here that is sadly becoming a theme, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the family of Abraham, right? We saw a couple of times that Abraham lied about his wife, Sarai and Sarah, calling her his sister because he was afraid that he would be killed because people wanted her. And what he ended up finding each time is that his assessment was wrong, right? Every time somebody found out that Sarah was actually his wife instead of his sister, they got very upset that they had been fooled and put in a position to offend God. Now, again, the use of language here is going to be something that is easier to understand, having known a little bit more about the Canaanite pantheon, which is what leads Abraham to come together with Yahweh, who reveals himself as El. That's the whole thing that goes on there. Over time, as we've talked about, the concept of a pantheon evolves in Israel. A couple of thousand years before the birth of Christ, by that point, there's a belief that there are a whole host of other spiritual beings, but they are not actually gods, leading to the idea that there's one God. So that kind of evolves throughout Israel's history. But remember, it's Yahweh that Abraham's family is connecting with here. I will be your God, you will be my people. I am Yahweh, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. That's the way that always begins, right? Why does that matter for us? Because it's important to remember that while they're polytheistic, the people that Abraham's family and children are encountering also believe in Abraham's God, in Isaac's God. That's a God that they believe in within what they believe to be a pantheon of gods. So they're trying to honor that. Why does that matter? Because Abraham and now Isaac are always afraid that people are going to kill them or hurt them for the sake of the wives that they're married to, so they lie about it, and then only to find out that the people that they have been duplicitous with had no intention of behaving that way anyway, and are now concerned that Abraham's God or Isaac's God is going to deliver wrath upon them. So it's 10:45. Let's go ahead and work our way through the scriptures together. When a famine gripped the land, you're going to find here that a lot of what's happening in this chapter, because we're kind of in a transitional period. Kate sat down with me last night. She's like, "What are you teaching about tomorrow?" I said, "I'm in 26." She was like, "Oh." And I was like, "Yeah, I know." It's like the most boring part of Genesis. Like the beginning of Genesis, a lot of fun to teach about. End of Genesis, a lot of fun to teach about. Middle of Genesis is not that much fun to teach about. Why? Because there's a lot of kind of transitions as we're working our way through Israel's history. Is that important? Yes. And as my Old Testament professor used to say, it kind of helps knowing that stuff and reading it in order helps to put your kind of Old Testament closet in order so you can kind of make sense of where everything goes and how things line up. But you're going to find here that what's being said and the story about Isaac that we're about to read through is setting up Isaac to be following in the footsteps of his father. Isaac is very much like his father. And subsequently, just as Abraham was blessed, Isaac is going to be blessed. And that is directly in line with the promise that God made to Abraham. So we're getting a couple of things. One is we're supposed to respect the family line. The other is God is being faithful to God's promises. God will do what God has said that God will do. That's important for Israel, particularly around the time that these stories are circulating with a fervor during the 400 years of Israel's captivity in Egypt, because it is contained within those stories that God tells Abraham that his descendants will be in slavery for 400 years, and then they will be freed. So these stories are circulating in the slave camps in Egypt. And as these stories are circulating, and part of the story is God has said you'll be in slavery for 400 years, and then you'll be freed from that. It's important to tell a story that continues to reinforce the idea that God has done what God has said that God will do. Because if God has been faithful, then you can realistically hope that God will be faithful. Hardest part of that, well, let me say it differently. One of the harder parts of that period of slavery had to have been the knowledge that your community is going to be in slavery for 400 years, and you're only 200 years into that time. So there's no chance that you're going to be rescued from slavery, according to what your faith community believes, and in fact is actually what happened. So you're going to see a lot of comparison here, and the idea is Isaac is following in his father's footsteps and should be respected accordingly. And God will do what God has said that God will do. In Abraham's time, Isaac set out toward Gerar and toward King Abimelech of the Philistines, verse 2. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Don't go down to Egypt, but settle temporarily in the land that I will show you. Stay in this land as an immigrant, and I will be with you and bless you, because I will give you all of these lands to you and your descendants." So you're talking about the lands of the Canaanites, and remember, these lands, these people groups are all incredibly well connected throughout history. They're the same. It's the same ethnicity, different tribes that evolve. So we're going to move largely into the land of the Canaanites, and then kind of specifically into a relationship with the Philistines. I will give you all of these lands to you and to your descendants. I will keep my word, which I gave to your father Abraham. So, I mean, that's a key. As we transition through the generations, we're going to continue to reinforce that God has done what God has said that God would do, which is why in what is called the historic preamble in the book of Deuteronomy to the covenant that is made between God and the people of Israel, God introduces God's self by saying, "I am the God of your ancestors of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." That's an introduction. That is followed by a historic preamble, which is unique to that formation of that covenant. I've taught this before, so you may have heard it before. It's unique to that. That covenant-making process is standard for even secular covenants, which is not really a thing in Canaanite lands in second millennia BC in the Near East. So they're following a well-known format, a well-known pattern of covenant making anyway. What makes what God says, what Yahweh says to the people of Israel unique is that in the formation of that covenant, God has already acted generously on behalf of Israel, and that is found in what we call the historic preamble, which is, the introduction is, I am the God of your ancestors of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do you know what follows that in almost every introduction that God makes about God's self? I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, right? God will do what God has said that God will do. In the making of the covenant, instead of requiring something of the lesser party because God is more powerful, God says, I'm entering into a relationship with you and I've already acted on your behalf to your benefit without requiring anything of you, which is a strange concept, even according to the people who believed in this Canaanite pantheon idea that all this originates in. That relationship with Yahweh is unique. And so what you start getting out of the Semitic communities, the people of Israel, is you may have believed in a pantheon, but Yahweh is El, and also the other gods in the pantheon are not actually gods. Oh, and also Yahweh, El, behaves differently than your stories about what you believe to be these other gods behave. Because God acts providentially on our behalf without expecting something of us in return before doing it, which is where the concept of unconditional love, scripturally, originates. So what we get here in the very opening part of this is a reaffirmation that God has kept God's promises. And that affirmation is going to evolve over time as more promises are kept. Okay. I will keep my word, which I gave to your father Abraham. I will give you as many descendants as the stars in the sky. That should sound familiar to you. And I will give your descendants all of these lands. Also should sound familiar to you. All of the nations on the earth will be blessed because of your descendants. Also familiar. I will do this because Abraham obeyed me and kept my orders, my commandments, my statutes, and my instructions. So the covenant is being reaffirmed in the next generation. Abraham's gone. Now the covenant is being affirmed through Isaac. God is following through with what God said that God would do and the promise God made to Abraham, who's not even here anymore. We also, throughout the Old Testament, have this continual reference to the idea that God is faithful out several generations. Also, sometimes the assertion that God punishes out for up to 4 generations. We see that come up from time to time. What does that mean? I think one of the key takeaways there, people struggle with this. I'm a jealous God, right? I think people struggle with, am I being punished by God because of the actions of my ancestors when we read through those kinds of statements in the scriptures? I think that changes according to the new covenant. So I think it's a valid assessment of the old covenant. I think that relationship does change a little bit in the new covenant. So my short answer is no, I don't think you're being punished by God for the actions of your ancestors. I do think that the actions of our ancestors have an awful lot to do with where we end up and why we are where we are. I'm in Oklahoma because of the Trail of Tears. You're in Oklahoma for a reason too. So I think that affects us. I do think that there's a lot of merit to the idea that the blessings that come from your relationship with God affect other generations in your family line as well. I think that's valid. And I think there are probably an awful lot of reasons that that is valid, not the least of which is that it is common for a healthy relationship with God modeled in your life to be a relationship that not only permeates your life but transcends your life and is adopted by other people in your family line, which is why we teach the idea of healthy relationships so often. That kind of relationship not only not only is it attractive because it's effective, it's meaningful, it's effective, which makes it attractive. So not only is it attractive to other people in your family line, but what God is going to do in and through you is not, and this is where the idea of the well with living water from John 4 comes from. What God does in you doesn't just stay within you, it overflows from you to affect those around you as well. So there's some good theology there, I think, about how what God is doing in you is also positively affecting the people in your family line as well. Okay, I'll shut up and move on. Verse 5, I will do this because, I already said that. Verse 6, so Isaac lived in Gerar. When the men who lived there asked about his wife, here we go, he said, she's my sister, because he was afraid to say my wife, thinking that the men who live there will kill me for Rebekah because she's very beautiful. I am so glad that the patriarchs all thought that their spouses were very beautiful. It makes me so happy that they were with people that they loved and were attracted to, and because that seems to be a thing, so I'm glad for that. Also, they're just terrified that people are going to kill them and steal their wives. That is like, there's a major running fear here. Now I know, and I just said this a minute ago, that we are supposed to see this as Isaac is following in Abraham's footsteps. We've talked a lot about this in the past, each time Abraham has done it. But I think every time we read through it, it's important for us to take a minute and process the fact that it's scenes like this, understanding that they happen in a different time, in a different place, in a different culture. I get that. I get that standards in a patriarchal culture in the Middle East would have been different several thousand years ago. I get that too. At the same time, scenes like this have contributed to the oppression of women throughout the very long history of Christianity, and I think it's important to point that out. Rebekah is used as a piece of property. As much as Isaac loves her, she's a piece of property here who ends up having to do something that she's not privy to or part of for the sake of Isaac's fear. Isaac's fear, just like Abraham's fear, causes Rebekah, and before that, Sarah, to have to be the one to deal with the hardship. They're making Rebekah and Sarah do something very difficult, borderline reprehensible, for the sake of assuaging their own fear. That's not healthy, specifically in terms of how it's led to different versions of patriarchy and the oppression of women over the course of Christianity's history. It's just not healthy, period, to make other people suffer for the sake of my fears. That's not a healthy way to relate to people anyway, in any capacity, and it continues to happen here. Now, I understand, again, that what we're supposed to be seeing here is that Isaac is behaving the way Abraham behaved, and God is blessing Isaac because God blessed Abraham, so on and so forth. I sat through class after class where I'm told that I need to look at this through the lens of the people who lived in that time. The standards were different, the culture was different. That's called the historical critical approach to biblical interpretation. I get it, I understand it, but I also think we need to look at it through the lens of what God has taught us in the intervening thousands of years about what it looks like to live in healthier relationships than the relationships that humanity had at the beginning of God's relationship with humans. It stands to reason that just like the longer I know God, the more I'm going to be transformed into the image of God, meaning hopefully having healthier views about things and healthier behaviors and habits and whatnot. It stands to reason that just like that happens with an individual, it also happens with a people group. And the longer that a people group is in relationship to God over the generations, hopefully the closer that people group comes to healthier behaviors and healthier attitudes and healthier ways of relating to people and creation and so on and so forth. On that subject, and I won't stay on it very long, Stewards of Eden is one of my favorite books right now. It is written by Sandy Richter, who is my favorite Old Testament professor. She wrote Epic of Eden. Download it, I listened to it on audiobook, but it's a great book talking about the accommodations that we have made and turned a blind eye to regarding our responsibility toward creation for the sake of our convenience. And she brings out Old Testament references, does a great job. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's called Stewards of Eden. Okay, here we go. He was afraid, thinking the men who live there will kill me for Rebekah. Why? Because she's very beautiful and you're afraid. Verse 8, after Isaac had lived there for some time, we don't know how long, the Philistines' king, King Abimelech, looked out his window and saw Isaac laughing together with his wife Rebekah. Weird. So Abimelech summoned Isaac and said, she's your wife, isn't she? How could you say she's my sister? See how, like, all of the fears, completely unfounded all the time. At least this set of fears for both Abraham and Isaac are completely unfounded. Doesn't it make you wonder why Isaac had to have known this story about Abraham and Sarah? That happened twice. And in each instance, Abraham was wrong. And now Isaac is in the same position, has the same fear, doesn't learn from his father's action, right? There's in my humble opinion, a great message there about learning from the mistakes, not only of your elders, but of the other people in your life. Most of us joke about how we had to learn things the hard way, and the jokes are funny, I get that, I've made them myself. But that's ridiculous. The fact that we're not learning from the lessons that other people who love us have learned is ridiculous. So learn from those things. Be willing to. Don't learn things the hard way. Learn things the easy way. Makes a lot more sense. All right. How could you say she's my sister? Isaac responded, because I thought that I might be killed because of her. Abimelech said, what are you trying to do to us? Before long, one of the people would have slept with your wife, and you would have made us guilty. Again, Isaac's completely wrong. They didn't want to do something wrong. Now they even know, and just like with Sarah, now they know, and guess what they don't do? Kill him and take his wife. Doesn't happen. Didn't happen with Abraham and Sarah either. Verse 11, Abimelech gave orders to all the people, anyone who touches this man or his wife will be put to death. Completely the opposite of Isaac's assessment. Also, we have these people that we greatly respect, who have a good relationship with God, to whom God is faithful generation after generation. That's great. One of the things I get out of this is I don't have to be perfect in order for God to be faithful to God's relationship with me, right? They're not perfect. They're probably growing. I hope they're growing. I don't know. They keep making the same mistakes over and over again, but then again, so do I. So I don't have to be perfect in order for God to love me, and I love that, right? These people that we're supposed to be respecting are people who continue to make the same mistake over and over again, one of which is that they regularly fail to correctly assess people. Have you heard me say in the past that there's this kind of standard rule that given a lack of information, 80% of the time, we're prone to make negative assessments about the intentions of other people. We see that happen here over and over again. Abraham and Isaac continually make negative assessments without enough information about what they think other people are going to do. I think we do that in two ways. One is, I think when we're thinking through something, and we think through things sometimes in the echo chamber of our own mind, right? But when we're thinking through things, we'll often assign to people the worst of motivations. It's based on this natural human tendency to want to prepare ourselves for the worst possible outcome, right? And so that seems like it makes sense. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best, right? I don't know. Do you want your motivations to always be assessed as being negative before you've even had a chance to actually do something? If somebody's constantly thinking you're going to do the worst thing you could possibly do in a circumstance, and yet you continue to not always do the worst thing that you could possibly do in a circumstance, what that means is we're regularly prone to assessing people the wrong way. Now, just like we do that with how we think people will behave, we also do that with what we think about what other people think of us. We will often be terrified that other people, if you're a people pleaser, this is a hard thing for you. We'll be terrified that other people think badly of us, which is normally not true for two reasons. One is, just like I said a minute ago, we're prone to thinking that people think worse of us than they actually do. The other is that we're prone to thinking people think more frequently about us than they actually do. Most people are not thinking about us that often, right? That's just not happening. Most people, and even at that, even when we do stupid things, most of us are prone to being like, that was stupid, and now I'm going to move on because I've done a bunch of stupid things too. Or, gosh, I feel bad for so and so. I know what it's like to be in that situation. I've embarrassed myself, that way time and time again. Most people, funny, I think this is ridiculous because it's probably the opposite of that 80% rule. Most of us will give people the benefit of the doubt if given the chance to do it most of the time. So most people, what is the takeaway? Most people are not going to behave in the worst way they possibly could all the time. And most people are not thinking badly about you. That's very unlikely. Give people, and I think this is a lesson that comes out of this, at least it is for me, give people the chance to think what they think and communicate to you what they think. Don't make that presumption, because there's probably way more than an 80% chance that you're wrong about whatever you think they think. All right, here we go. Verse 12, Isaac planted grain in the land and reaped 100 sherim that year because the Lord had blessed him. Sherim is what? My Bible says an unknown measure of grain, which probably makes sense. I've never heard of that measure before myself. Verse 13, Isaac grew richer and richer until he was extremely wealthy, just like Abraham, right? We're supposed to make the comparison. He had livestock, both flocks and cattle, many servants. As a result, the Philistines envied him. The Philistines closed up and filled with dirt all of the wells that his father's servants had dug during his father Abraham's lifetime. Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us because you become too powerful among us." So he's getting too wealthy. They're worried. We're supposed to see that Isaac, who is Abraham's descendant, is becoming just as powerful as Abraham, but in his own right. Not just because of what he inherited, but he's been able to do this himself. Verse 17, so Isaac moved away from there and camped in the valley of Gerar and lived there. Isaac dug out again the wells that were dug during the lifetime of his father Abraham. The Philistines had closed them up after Abraham's death. Isaac gave them the same names that his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug wells in the valley and found a well there with fresh water. Isaac's shepherds argued with Gerar's shepherd, each claiming, "This is our water." So Isaac named the well Esek because they quarreled with him. That's just an origination story for a known place. They dug another well and argued about it too, so he named it Sitnah. He left there and dug another well. A lot of well digging, but they didn't argue about it. So he named it Rehoboth and said, "Now the Lord has made an open space for us and has made us fertile in the land." Then he went up from Gerar to Beersheba. The Lord appeared to him that night and said, "I am the God," here we go, "of your father Abraham." Later, it will be, "I am the God of your father Abraham and Isaac," and then Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Why? I've had a relationship with your family this long. I've been faithful to each one of them. Remember that. Don't be afraid because I'm with you. I will bless you. I will give you many children for my servant Abraham's sake. So Isaac built an altar there and worshipped in the Lord's name. Abraham did this too, frequently. Isaac pitched his tent there, and his servants dug a well. Has nothing to do with anything, but it sounds like being a servant during this particular period involves an awful lot of well digging, which does not sound like a good time to me. Verse 26, Abimelech set out towards him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his ally, and Phicol, the commander of his forces. Isaac said to him, "Why have you come after me? You resented me and sent me away from you." They said, "We now see that the Lord was with you. We propose there be a formal agreement between us and that we draw up a treaty with you." Yeah, I thought that might be the case. The word there is berit, which translates better to covenant. "You must not treat us badly, since we haven't harmed you and since we have treated you well at times. Then we will send you away peacefully, for you're now blessed by the Lord." Isaac prepared a banquet for them, and they ate and drank. They got up. Now, remembering this, the banquet is a necessary part of the covenant ratification process, right? So they got up early in the morning, and they gave each other their word. Isaac sent them off, and they left peacefully. That day, Isaac's servants informed him about the well they had been digging and said to him, "We found water." He called it Sheba, therefore the city's name has been Beersheba until today. Origination story. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. They made life very difficult for Isaac and Rebekah. Why? because they're marrying outside of their culture. Remember how important it was that Isaac find a spouse from Abraham's own family. There's a real intent here, and not only just with this family, but in this time period, to make sure that the marriages that are happening as much as possible stay within not just the culture, but sometimes lines of kinship. And we talked about that a little bit before. Cousin was seen as a desirable match, if at all possible. All right, we're going to be in chapter 27 next week. We're still working our way through the transition into the story of Isaac and then into the story of Jacob. There's going to be a little bit of overlap here for the next few chapters. And then, not too long from now, things are going to start getting a little bit more interesting again. What questions or what thoughts do you have as we're kind of working our way through this part of Genesis? Or about anything else, for that matter. Oh. Right. 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 Not lying? Not supposed to lie? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've struggled with that one too. And the best is wrong. The most sensical explanation I've heard about it is the idea of the codification of culture into the scriptures, where we see the nature of God represented in the stories of the scriptures, but we also very much see the normative aspect of the culture that we're reading about put into the scriptures as well. And then we end up reading a little bit further, and as God's relationship with the people group evolves, all of a sudden, some things start changing. There really is no Jew or Greek or slave or free or male or female, but everybody's equal in the eyes of God. Well, that's not what I was hearing in Genesis when we were talking about people being possessions of other people. So does that mean that God changed God's mind? Probably not. What it means is that God changed humanity's mind collectively over the course of time. I don't know if that's the best explanation, but it's the one that made the most sense to me. Otherwise, you're reading through that thinking, well, every time I get scared, I'll just throw somebody else under the bus, Don't have to outrun the bear, just have to outrun you, All right, any other thoughts or questions? And if not, since we're early, I'll take a minute and tell you about what's going on in the United Methodist Church right now, if you want to know. Okay, if you think of something else you want to ask, let me know. So I'm sure that you've heard over the course of the last few years, I want to preface this by saying that what I'm about to say is exactly like my trip to the southernmost point. It's going to be anticlimactic when we get there. And you might also be tired and cranky. So, but you know what's been going on in the United Methodist Church. We have been talking about full inclusion now for some time. There was supposed to be a general conference in which that was decided. Kate and I attended, not as delegates, but just because we wanted to be there. This was in 2019, and nothing was decided. And then it was pushed off. And then we had a pandemic, so it got pushed off again, and then it got pushed off again, and now it's been pushed off again. And this last time that it's been pushed off, now if I'm not mistaken, I am mistaken. I'm not sure what they're doing with General Conference right now. We might not, I'll get the information and get it to you, because whatever I tell you right now is going to be wrong, save for the fact that it's been pushed off again. Council of Bishops just met, and I'm not sure what the outcome of that was relative to when General Conference is actually going to be. I know that we have to vote again for new delegates, because a lot of they were going to continue to have the same delegates go that went to the 2019 General Conference, which were the delegates that were at the 2018 General Conference, because we do this every 4 years. But we had this special conference in 2019. And they're like, well, let's have the same delegates go. And then they voted for delegates again. Long story short, a lot of the people throughout the connection that we voted on as delegates have retired from ministry since they were voted in as delegates, and some have passed on. So looks like we're going to have other votes. All that is to say this. It does not any longer look like the United Methodist Church will have a big debate about this at General Conference. It looks like that part of things is probably done. I do expect a couple of things, and I'm glad to tell you what they are. But the reason that's done is because the last time the General Conference was pushed off, there was a communication that came from the Wesley Covenant Association, which is the group within the United Methodist Church that does not believe in inclusion. And they said, if General Conference gets pushed off again, we're going to go ahead and launch the new Global Methodist Church. So they did. And when they did, a number of churches, honestly fewer than I think any of us expected, voted to disaffiliate and join that new denomination. One of them, well, I'll get to that in a minute. That led to a whole series of conversations. Now, there are some churches that want to disaffiliate, which has led to a whole another series of conversations. But the Council of Bishops got together and worked with our judicial council. Our judicial council is, I mean, it always sounds funny to me to say it this way, but you're basically talking about church law. These are the people that, it's the board in the church that takes a look at decisions that have been made and policies that have been enacted and determines whether or not they're in line with the discipline, okay? They all decided that there's already a process for disaffiliation. So since the Global Methodist Church went ahead and launched, and since there's already a process for disaffiliation in the Book of Discipline, they decided that there's really no reason to try to split up the denomination anymore. So as a result of that, they gave, at least in our conference, I don't know if it's true for everyone, in our annual conference, which is the state of Oklahoma, they gave everybody up until this October to decide if they wanted to disaffiliate this year. Now you may be thinking to yourself, does that mean we can never disaffiliate? No, we can disaffiliate in any year. They're just having a special conference for it this year, and it's in October. If a church disaffiliates, one of two things can now happen. They can either join this new denomination, or they can join any other group they want to join, or not join any group at all. So what we ended up finding so far is that a lot of churches have, let me rephrase that. We have not had a lot of churches leave. As of right now in Oklahoma, Asbury United Methodist in Tulsa voted to disaffiliate. First United Methodist in Tulsa voted to disaffiliate. I think, if I remember correctly, Ardmore First did. And then there are two other churches in smaller communities, and I'm lost at trying to remember what their names were. I'm sure there will be some more. That process of disaffiliation involves a few things. Church has to vote. I believe it's a 2/3 majority, if I remember correctly. Has to have a vote where the district superintendent is present. Then the disaffiliation process involves paying a certain number of apportionments, I believe, through the next year, and paying back any grants that were received by the congregation from the district or from the annual conference. So if you're curious, let's say Southern Hills wanted to, which I believe is highly unlikely. Our price tag would be somewhere between $600,000 and $750,000 to disaffiliate. So not only does it have to be, once you voted, the annual conference has to approve the disaffiliation request, which is why we're having this special conference in October to approve disaffiliation requests. I haven't heard any chatter about anybody at conference trying to be difficult about it. Everybody's mostly like, if you want to leave, well, you know, more power to you, do good things. But the price tag is different. Places like Asbury have that. They've got something like a $30 million endowment or something like that. So smaller communities, smaller churches probably will struggle with that. But anyway, what we've seen is that a lot of churches that are leaving are not going with the Global Methodist Church. Many of them are trying to remain independent. And it'll be kind of interesting to see how that evolves. If you're a mega church, That's a much easier prospect than if you were not a megachurch. So there will be some time to watch that unfold. Now, what do I expect will happen at General Conference? I expect we'll see some language removed from the Book of Discipline. We've had lots of conversations over the years about what should happen in the Book of Discipline regarding inclusivity. It was in the 1970s. I'm going to get this wrong. I think it was 72. It was either 72 or 76, when language was put into the Book of Discipline. And the language quoted says, homosexuality is not compatible with the Christian lifestyle. That was inserted in the 70s, right around the same time that the word pedophile in the Bible started being translated as homosexual, which I think happened for the first time in, I'd have to look that up. I brought it to you once before. Same thing, same movement, same time period. I should give you the word because you're going to want to know. It is arsenicatai. Arsenicatai is the word. So all this is happening around the same time. Well, there's been, we've been talking about this at General Conference, every General Conference every 4 years since then. There have been a number of revisions, ideas for revisions submitted, so on and so forth. My suspicion is that what we're looking at the next General Conference is a conversation about the removal of that phrase. There may be some conversations about kind of specific affirmations put in. That's possible. But my suspicion is we're looking at the removal of the phrase from where it exists in the Book of Discipline, for the same reason that the fact that our Book of Discipline, like anything else that's not in our Book of Discipline is not governed by our Book of Discipline. Our Book of Discipline also doesn't say you can't have red or crimson chairs in the church. So therefore, we never care about whether or not we can have crimson chairs in the church because it's not in the Book of Discipline. If they put in a clause that said you cannot have crimson chairs in the church, then we couldn't have crimson chairs in the church, and all we would need to do is remove the clause, and then all of a sudden we could put crimson chairs in the church. Does that make sense? So my suspicion is that's what this next General Conference will look like. I also suspect that a majority of the delegates that would have opposed the removal of that phrase will not be at the General Conference because they will be with churches that have disaffiliated by the point at which that happens. So I've got 10 minutes left. I'm sure that was clear as mud. Let me answer questions as best I can, knowing full well that I may not know the answer to the question that you asked, but go ahead. Yes.
There's no question that they were leaning toward going this time for the Global Baptist, waiting to see what the United Methodist Church does.
I believe that's in line with what I've heard, that there are a number of churches waiting to see what happens, and that if the language is removed, some churches will try to disaffiliate. I think if the language remains, some other churches will try to disaffiliate too. So it's a matter of kind of waiting to see what happens there. Can I predict that? Nope. No. To quote one of my favorite lines, in over 20 years of theological study and reflection, I have learned two things. There is a God, and I am not God. So I don't know for sure what'll happen. If I had to, I don't think I'll be likely to go to General Conference probably. I think I'll be surprised. I think I'll be surprised if there are enough delegates to keep that phrase in the discipline. My expectation is that it would probably be removed. Now, if it does, the question is what will the African churches do? That's a very complex question. The African churches represent a large portion of Methodism, United Methodism, but the African, and I'm talking about the churches in Africa. Africa represents a very large portion, something like 4 million of the, let's see, where are we at? No, we're at 8 million. I think they have like 2 million of the 8 million people that are in the United Methodist Church. So they have a lot of people. Two things are happening there that are going to affect that. Some of their churches are already leaving. Some of their central conferences are already having that discussion. And so if that's the case, you're talking about a drastic reduction in the number of delegates that will be at General Conference. The other thing that's happening is that inclusivity as a concept has begun to work its way through the African churches about 2.5 years ago. So how much headway does that make? There's a cultural issue with that in some parts of Africa, so it would be interesting to see what it does, but it has begun to work its way through those churches as well. That's what I know, anyway. What other questions do you have? Yeah? Right.
Is there a movement to form another group of Methodist churches on this liberal basis also?
Yes, okay, so is there a movement for a more, let's say, a more progressive version of the church? Yes, and that's being led by Adam Hamilton at Church of the Resurrection. The churches that coalesce around that group, they will stay United Methodist, presumably if the language is removed. And then if not, we'll see another opportunity there for churches that want to coalesce around that grouping of churches. So I expect that'll happen too. And then the other thing that comes from that is that we may see the process of disaffiliation change in the Book of Discipline so that there's not a payout required for churches that leave. That at present, I said apportionments, right, and grants. I didn't talk about pension liability. That's another big deal. And that's part of the reason why ours would be so high, because you have to pay a portion. For however long a clergy person served at your church is responsible for that much of their pension payout for however much longer they are alive. Does that make sense? So you have to pay that before you can leave. So my suspicion is there's going to be a conversation. And the conversation so far about changing disaffiliation has only focused on that, really. Nobody really cares about continuing to pay a year's worth of apportionments. Nobody really cares too much, at least in terms of the delegates, about paying back grants that were given 10 years ago or something like that. But people do care, and I think rightly so, about, well, what's going to happen to these clergy who served honorably, and we're relying on a pension and they're trying to live on that, because our pension liability is only funded based on what's continuing to go into apportionments every year. If that stops, we don't have money to pay what has been promised to these people that they're living off of now in retirement or intending to. And as you know, I mean, there's a difference between you just began your career and you have the opportunity to choose to invest yourself versus the pension was what you were relying on for the 40 years that you served in ministry, and now it's gone, right? So there will be a conversation about that, and in my humble opinion, there should be. I think that's what's the word I'm looking for? That's an obligation we need to meet because it's a promise that we made to people, so however that goes. Any other questions? Yeah? Hey, bring them on. Yeah. That actually, the one church model, and just to reiterate, that was a plan. There were several plans offered, but this particular plan basically said any church can decide for itself where it is on this topic and still remain United Methodist. And that's essentially, did you follow what the Episcopal Church went down the same road several years ago. And the outcome for them was that each church and each diocese can decide. So there are a number of people who've said that, and you can still remain Methodist. What we found in the interim is that the churches that lean progressive have no issues with that plan, and the churches that lean conservative do. And in the dialogue that ensued, and there was much of it, the main point that kept coming out was that the churches that leaned conservative did not want to be in a denomination with churches that were doing something they disagreed with. The progressive churches were completely fine with every church being able to do what they wanted to do to a point, because to a point, then it also becomes a social justice issue. And there was a lot of dialogue about that as well. People try to bring up things which oddly are based on, again, a wrong retranslation of a word in the Bible. There have been a lot of arguments, as you can imagine, and most of them have not been kind, even on the floor of General Conference. But the biggest issue right now with the Global Methodist Church is that theologically they don't make any sense. In that, they keep saying, this is actually why my sister left them. She was one of the leaders in the Oklahoma chapter of the WCA, and she left. This is part of why. They keep saying that scriptural orthodoxy is their rule. That's kind of been their song. Well, we're going to follow what the scripture says. This is what my Bible says, and you're never going to tell me otherwise. Interestingly, those same words have been uttered by some of the worst dictators in world history, but that, you got to be careful of that because the Bible is interpreted. And all that said, this is what my Bible says, you'll never tell me otherwise. So when the GMC was forming, everybody said, well, does that mean you're going to defrock your female clergy based on what the Bible says? And they said, well, no, we're not going to do that. And we said, are you sure you're not going to do that? Because, scriptural orthodoxy, right? At least the way they define it. There's not the only way to define it. My Bible says what I think it says, and you'll never tell me otherwise is not really a very good definition of scriptural orthodoxy, but that's irrelevant. And they said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I'm summarizing like years worth of arguments. But so the response to that collectively was, well, you said scriptural orthodoxy, and we can point out the verses, right? You know the verses, you've heard them. Women shall be what? Silent and learn in full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach. I can exegete that in a way that makes sense to you, but I don't have time to do that because it's 11:30. All that said, they came back and said this. They said, well, those verses are just a cultural expression of something that was common at the time that has since changed. And you know what the progressive side of the church said? We totally agree with you. You're so right. But then the other things that they don't like, that was not the case. So those arguments have been complex for sure. And I think what a lot of that boils down to, sadly, is less, this is what I think my faith says, and more, this is what I was raised to believe and what my friends think. Yes. That's been, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the scriptural orthodoxy part of that, then that conversation evolves rather quickly to what does that mean? What is scriptural orthodoxy? For instance, you know that the New Testament doesn't give you a set of laws the way the Old Testament does, but you do get a rubric for decision making. And Paul is the one who lays that out very well in Romans. And when you go through that rubric, it ends in what would philosophically be called moral relativism. Now, if you're coming out of a series of American generations raised with an absolutist mentality, those two things clash. Absolutism says there's one way to do things. There's one right and one wrong. Moral relativism says that's not the case. That is contextual. And that's what Paul says. You've heard me teach about this, the argument about do we eat meat or do we not eat meat? And people will listen to that and go, that's irrelevant. I don't care if you eat meat. Well, the issue is not whether you care about it. The issue is that Paul's creating a rubric for how to make decisions. He follows that up with which day is holy. So he gives two examples just so you'll know he's not talking about an issue. He's creating a way to make decisions before your relationship with God is intact. Does that mean we don't have laws as a country? No, it's not what it means at all. It means when you're trying to decide what is right and what is wrong, and this is Paul's rubric, you do what you believe best honors God. And you let other people do what they believe best honors God. Listen to this, so long as you're not infringing upon the rights of other people. That's not a bad place to start while you're getting to know God. It's a good rubric, right? So long as I'm not infringing upon the rights of other people, I'm going to do what best honors God, and I'm going to let other people do the same. So if you believe that eating meat is the best way to honor God, then Paul says eat the meat. Paul actually falls on what you and I would call the liberal side of that argument, because the conservative side would have said don't eat the meat. And Paul's very clear at the beginning of that he doesn't care. This is not an issue for me at all. I think it's fine. I think it's okay. He actually says, I think that the people who are on the conservative side of that argument are weak. He uses weak as the word to describe that. He said, I don't care at all. But he said, here's the thing. On the one hand, do what you believe honors God. And if you do what you think, so long as you're not infringing upon the rights of other people, if you do what you believe honors God, you're honoring God. And if you do the opposite of that, whatever you think best on, what you genuinely think best honors God, and you do the opposite of it, you're dishonoring God, even if you're doing that to placate other people. He tempers that by saying, and I'm going to summarize, also don't be a jerk. You don't need to flaunt what you believe in front of the people who disagree with you. Let them be who they are. You be who you are. These are not hills you need to die on because people were trying to die on those hills. Same way we are today. But then, right, and people will quote that verse, right? Don't do anything else that causes a brother or sister to stumble, right? That's immediately followed by, but also don't let anybody else tell you what you should do to honor God. And we don't normally quote that verse, even though it comes right after that, right? So Paul's creating a rubric that ends in moral relativism. Moral relativism in the sense that you do what you believe best honors God, and that may change over time, right? I may think I'm doing something that honors God, and the better I get to know God, now I think that maybe I need to change that, right? Paul's like, that's normal. That's exactly how that should work. Don't make other people fit into your mold. So that argument's been around for quite some time, and consequently, with regard to scriptural orthodoxy, that argument with regard to that has been, well, am I supposed to follow what I think the list of rules is, which is a real tough sell if you're talking about the new covenant, or am I supposed to apply this rubric? Well, if I'm more of an absolutist, I want everybody to follow a list of rules, or, the same list. I want everybody to follow. That's fair, right? That's an absolutist mentality. I want everybody to follow the same list. Interestingly, that list is always going to match up with what I have been culturally trained to believe is right and wrong, even if it doesn't necessarily match up with the scriptures. So, all right, I kept us 5 minutes over, and I know it's a topic that the church has been going through for just a really long time. I'll tell you more once there's more to know. I'm going to be going to this conference we have in October here, and I'll know how many churches have left at the time. To answer one question, do I intend to call for a vote? No, I don't. I don't intend to call for a vote. How can that work? I can call for a vote. The district superintendent can call for a vote. Neither of us are going to. Or the church's administrative board can vote to call for a vote. So if you wanted the administrative board to vote to call for a vote, you could certainly ask them to do that. But those are the ways in which we can accomplish that. Good question. Thank you for bringing that up. She said, didn't we already have a vote about where we were on this topic? We did, but it was not an official vote to disaffiliate. And that's what I was referring to. We voted in the chapel before the pandemic to find out where we were, on kind of where we sat as a congregation on the spectrum here. Does anybody remember how that came out? I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was right around 72% in favor of inclusion. That was the way that vote came out, yeah. And that, frankly, that combined with the fact that I don't intend to lead us away from inclusivity is the reason why I don't expect to be voting about this anytime soon. Yeah.
You said they have to pay,
Pension liability?
yeah, well, pension liability, whatever you call it.
Yeah.
I agree with that, but what if a church doesn't have, what if a church wants to disaffiliate, but they don't have the funds to pay to disaffiliate?
That's the catch right now. So if a church wants to disaffiliate and can't pay for it, they can't. They don't disaffiliate until they can afford to pay the bill, which is why I think that this General Conference will address the issue of cost there. I think some of that will change. But at the same time, that creates a really weird dynamic. For instance, I understand how organizational hierarchies work, right? But let's say, hypothetically, okay, let me give you a for instance. Let's say that I wanted to put crimson chairs in the church. And the Book of Discipline said, well, we can't put crimson chairs in the church. And the church is like, well, we're going to do it anyway. And the conference said, well, you can do that, but you're going to have to pay $750,000 to be able to do it. And you said, nope, we're going to do it anyway. And then the conference responds with the only power it has, which is to take your minister away. So they take your minister away. This has already happened. You respond by saying, well, okay, we'll just hire Matt back as a lay employee at the same rate of pay he was making before, and he can continue to lead us. And then the conference says, well, you can't do that. And you say, well, why not? What are you going to do about it? And that's where you get into a really weird standoff, because the annual conference, while if under the trust clause, if the church closed, the property would go back to the conference. But the conference outside of the trust clause has no actual authority over the property. The church does. So it's not like the conference can show up and lock the doors, or stand in front of the doors and keep people from coming inside. So there's been this weird play on relationship there, and a lot of that has evolved. There was a time in U.S. history when a bishop's word was law. People didn't argue with it. And I suspect, I hope we're still broadcasting, because I want them to hear this. I suspect that was during a time when bishops actually showed up in the churches and people, knew who they were, a spite of the absolutist thing. In our conference, what we've seen is that our cabinet has regularly simply just not shown up. And because of that, and I'm not going to repeat it, there's a derogatory nickname that I've heard go around about them. I think that's uncouth, and I don't support those kind of things. But the cabinet has just kind of failed to show up, even when they've been invited. We invited people to come to our 60th anniversary celebration, and they did not show up to that. That's been kind of a theme. So as that's happened, churches, and we've had this conversation here at Southern Hills, not brought up by me, have started to say things like, well, why are we paying $60,000 to the annual conference if they can't, if they're not ever showing up? Or the lead pastor gets death threats because somebody else on the other side of the city thought cilantro was marijuana, and we get radio silence from the annual conference even though we reached out. Like, why are we paying you $60,000 if we can't even get you to return phone calls and stuff? That has led to this circumstance I just said, where the authority of the conference has eroded, and people have then started to say, well, what are you really going to do about it? Stand in front of the door? Keep us from coming in? I don't think that the entirety of that conversation is healthy, because I don't think that conflict for the sake of conflict is healthy. But I do think it presents a great opportunity for us to say, well, what are some of the systemic issues with the leadership of our denomination, and what can we do to address some of those issues, so that there's a better relationship between our denominational hierarchy and the people that make up our churches? How can we rectify those things? Because clearly there's a break there, right? I was at a training session that they had at some swanky hotel downtown in Oklahoma City a few weeks ago for our district, and all the ministers of our district were there. And we had somebody come in from the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits to lead us through this training session. And they said, what is the number one issue right now in your district and in the conference and in the totality of the United Methodist Church? You want to guess what everybody said? And there were like 3 or 4 people who said it at the same time. Trust. They said right now, trust is the biggest issue that we're having across the board, something that we need to rectify. So I think that's given us an opportunity to move forward in a better way, because it's hard to know what to fix when you don't know what's wrong. All right, I kept you way over. Sorry about that. Let me pray for you, though. I'd hate for you to leave without being prayed over. God, we're grateful today for the opportunity to learn, grow, study, and have some holy conference about some of what our denomination is currently walking through. God, we pray that your Holy Spirit would go with us in the places that we will go, that you would guide us as we need to be guided in order to walk forward into life and that more abundantly lived. We pray, God, for those in our midst who are suffering from medical concerns and those who have procedures that will be upcoming. And we pray for those opportunities that will yet arise throughout the course of today and this week for us to live into the love that you are calling us to share. This we ask in your name. Amen. Thank you for coming.